To talk about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, we're joined from the San Francisco Bay Area by Nozomi Hayase. Naomi has actually done a PhD on WikiLeaks, so she's somewhat of an expert. Tell us a little more about your background, how you got so fixated on the issue of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange.
My PhD is based on a psychology, branch of psychology called liberation psychology, which is to really analyzes the structure of power and how the force of oppression affect us psychologically. So while I was at the graduate school studying about the social issue of social justice and historical colonization, WikiLeaks basically came to a public limelight in 2010. So then that changed my whole entire course of academic life, that I got very much interested in finding out what this organization is trying to accomplish in the world. And so ever since then, I started to follow, basically, first I was interested in how WikiLeaks became so effective because it really changed the media landscape in a dramatic way. But what in particular interested me was the coordinated attack that came from the United States government that purported, supposed to stand up for free speech, and the disinformation about WikiLeaks and the false narrative about what this organization has been doing. So then I started to write. I, basically became a journalist, and my purpose was to dismantle false narratives that come from the mainstream media. So then, after 10 years later, here I am. I just got deeply involved in defending WikiLeaks and now Julian Assange.
Well, that's certainly one way to define WikiLeaks, that they dismantle a lot of false narratives in the corporate media. More and more, it appears that the media, the way I'm looking at it now, having worked in it and studied it myself, that they seem to be laundering this information from the intelligence agencies. If the CIA spoke directly to the public, and they're doing that now too when these former CIA guys join as commentators, but if they just sent messages directly to the public, I don't know if the public would believe them, but if you launder it through the New York Times or the CNN, it gains credibility with the public. And look how they are destroying the reputation of Julian Assange.
And then for me, I must say one thing. I come from academia, and I was studying about the history of colonization and oppression that has happened in the past, And when WikiLeaks rose in 2010, it was just history was just set in motion, that I was able to see, the oppression that is happening, and that there's a way for me to engage in actually changing a course of history. So it was such a profoundly transformative experience for me that I was able to, put my academic knowledge into action through defending this organization.
One of the most important stories that you've written over the years, in which you used releases of WikiLeaks to change the story that was being told by the corporate media.
I think the publication of the Colorado Matter video, that really, it was the beginning, and I think it's really changed the way we look at the world, and also, especially for Americans, I think it's really cuts through this collective amnesia that we have as a culture about genocide of natives and the historic denial of what has been taking place on this soil, and how this is still being enacted overseas in the Middle East. This, and then there have been scholars, there have been journalists who were, trying to tell us about this untold history, and they have been discredited because they didn't have evidence, because they could not provide raw material in the way that WikiLeaks had provided. So to see that visceral image of, the state of uncensored state of modern war was exceptionally powerful. And I think it's really, I think we have not really understood the profound effect it has had to American psyche, so that we are still suffering from collective amnesia, but something happened in our memory, something started to happen. And, you know, and then now people are, I mean, we have been so much distracted from the actual publication that WikiLeaks released because of this US government's attack on Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. But we have to understand, you know, what WikiLeaks has done is significant for Americans, and why we have to defend Julian Assange and WikiLeaks.
To what extent has your work been accepted or rejected by your academic peers, and to what extent has it sort of kind of seeped into their consciousness and been either reflected or absorbed into their work?
I think that I personally find that there is hesitance on the part of people who are in the academia to touch events that are happening right now. So, you know, I mean, I worked with good professors, but some of them had a resistance to look at the wars that their government are still engaged in, such as, you know, war in Afghanistan and Iraq. But they're okay with talking about colonization in Algeria, for instance, or the things that have happened in the past. So so they want to have some kind of distance, you know. So to actually bring up the current events that are happening, the events that we must be a part of, we must engage actively to change its outcome, you know. There's that hesitance to go there. So,
go ahead.
And also, you know, there has not been, I mean, academia is really based on the research that has been done historically, right? So the publication that have been written about certain wars or social events, and the WikiLeaks, of course, you know, is a new phenomena. Nobody has written a book, or I mean, in academia, right? So there have not been enough literature about the organization. So obviously, there is a limitation as to how we, as young researchers coming into academia, and then try to legitimize the knowledge about this organization. I mean, that has been extremely difficult.
Fascinating. And I assume that you're speaking not only amongst in terms of just general psychology and that type of academia, but specifically also within liberation psychology and peers that are interested in that area. They are also resistant to WikiLeaks being discussed. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, some of them are. Or I would say that not many people know much about WikiLeaks, and especially, I mean, in recent years after the 2016 presidential election, I mean, everything have completely changed in the US. People who used to support Julian, I mean, they turned against him, and they think Julian is just a puppet for Putin or cost Trump presidency. So it became much more hostile environment now.
Yeah, it's really disgusting the way that Julian and WikiLeaks became unfashionable amongst polite society to talk about it after 2016.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly. And also, I think that among psychologists, I mean, there's a question of how is WikiLeaks related to psychology at all? You know,
yes.
WikiLeaks is a journalistic organization. It has nothing to do with psychology. So there's that criticism, I guess. Initially, when I wrote a dissertation about WikiLeaks, there was the kind of criticism that come from one of my professors, and you know, he made sure that I'm not studying political science, or I'm not studying sociology. I'm studying psychology. You know, so I had to really establish. I mean, so that was also challenging as well.
It's interesting, this term liberation psychology, obviously it came from liberation theology, is that right?
Yes, yes, and this is liberation psychology is one that was established by Ignacio Martin Vado, who lives in El Salvador, and he was actually assassinated by CIA-backed military, and you know, by basically standing up for his own people. And he wanted to create a psychology that could apply to his people, not just to back off a little bit, to just a few of you the background of this story. Psychology as it exists currently is very Eurocentric. And then, so that this psychology that we understand or we learn in United States or in Europe You know, we have this model of humankind, in a model of man or individuality that is based on certain kind of psychological makeup that are very much Eurocentric, based on European culture. And it doesn't give the space for other ways of existence. So for instance, people in different cultures, they have a different conception of a man. For instance, in South Africa, there is the notion of Ubuntu, you know, which is the idea of individual being connected to other people. So it's not like a Western self-contained individualism, but it's more like the I am part of you, you know, I am because of you. You know, there's the acknowledgement of interconnectedness. So they have that as a model of what it means to be human, which is different than European model of individualism. But there is no space for that. So that the Western psychology, psychology as it exists now, is basically it's like a form of hegemony. It's trying to make everybody conform to this European notion of man or manhood. So liberation psychology challenges that. And Ignatius Martin Battle wanted to create a psychology that actually frees people of other cultures from this European imperialism, basically. So that's how it started. And I find what Julian has done with WikiLeaks is very much that. I mean, very much support what, you know, liberation psychology is trying to do, because he was trying to liberate people around the world, those who are oppressed, and trying to have them restore their own experience through showing the oppression that has been done to them and the history that has been stolen from them.
You talk about collective amnesia, and I find that an interesting term because I wonder how much of it is enforced on the population and how much is willingly participated in. People don't want to face who they are, obviously, if there's something really ugly in their behavior. You could talk about an individual who's in denial about doing things, or a whole society and a history of a society. So here's Assange, and I don't think he was very well liked even in 2006 with the collateral murder, let alone the mess of the election in 2016. So he was already, and that's what any good journalist or researcher does, and who has a big megaphone to try to make society realize you've got this problem, you got to correct it. Instead, what's the reaction been?
We humans are historical beings. We find our place through our understanding of history, what has taken place in the past. And then out of the knowledge, we create future. And the history has been stolen from us. And that's why, you know, WikiLeaks, Julian cited Orwell's dictum, you know, those who control the past control the future, you know. So basically, and then the role of journalists, they are not just disseminating information that are happening now. They are supposed to also help us remember our history, and then claim our own past and history. So that's what WikiLeaks has done. And so the law images that have been revealed through the collateral matter video, we were able to see forgotten past, the past that we are not allowed to see, the past that have been altered. That's a significant moment that those who are willing to look at, we are able to remember something that's still deeply in our psyche. So that's why I think what Julian has done is very significant. And he changed the face of journalism, really. I mean, journalism could go deeper. I mean, journalists, their job is to restore history, and so that ordinary people can claim their own history and participate in history. And that's what WikiLeaks has done. And that's why I personally support WikiLeaks and what Julian has done. Because we haven't seen anything like this before. Nobody has done this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that one of the things that really resonates with me when you're speaking about that is it's not just distant history. I mean, we've already talked about this to an extent, but that it was so recent that it was almost present compared with, you know, exposing the transgressions of a government that was, you know, that existed decades ago. And not only that, but when you say it changed journalism, I think, I don't know if you agree with this or to what extent you agree with this, but it it revealed what journalism was in comparison with what we always thought it was. It revealed
Yes.
how wrong the mainstream press had been. We assumed that it was as legitimate as what WikiLeaks showed us, but it took WikiLeaks showing us how wrong they were to realize that it had been a broken system all this time. And I don't know, you know, and that reminds me of what you're saying about actually pushing back on a Eurocentric psychology by just saying, oh wait, no, you're not actually the entire, you know, representation of psychological existence that, you know, that we've always kind of just assumed that it was. But
Right.
to what extent, though, do you think that, you know, regardless, like whatever happens with Assange moving forward, which, I mean, it does not look good at all. I think we'd be deluding ourselves to say that this looks like anything other than an absolute, you know, debacle and disaster of human rights and legal injustice. But moving forward, do you think there will come a point where either through your work and the work of others that psychology and academia in general will actually give a fair look at WikiLeaks? Or is it going to be decades down the line? How long do you think that's going to take, or will it happen at all? I guess is my question.
Well, I think that I personally think that the psychologist can play a very essential role in freeing Julian Assange, which is to, you know, we are those who are trained to understand the psychological manipulation, you know, the in the domain of emotions and the impulses and unconscious, which, you know, which are kind of hidden, which are used by the mainstream media to manipulate us and to engineer our consent. And so we were very much, you know, able to see, we have eyes to see the psychological dimension. And we should use our expertise to actually dismantle this psychological manipulation and to let public know what's happening, which I think, you know, the psychologist, clinical psychologist, Lisa Johnson does so well. And more of us, I think, need to do this work. And so it's not, you know, from my perspective, it's not just information. There's something deeper that is involved, that creating this collective amnesia and also apathy and indifference, which is, you know, for instance, even I think people get information, accurate information. There are some people who don't want to act, some people who cannot accept what is presented to them. And it's because there's some kind of blockages that prevent them from remembering, because there's something that, and that is the domain of psychology, that we have to understand what makes it impossible for people to accept the reality. And good example of this, I find, is what's happening in, you know, in the US political arena. I mean, every 4 years, American people come back to the electoral arena and engage in this, you know, ridiculous political game of lesser of the two evil. I mean, every 4 years. And then every time it gets worse and worse. And still they do it. I mean, they don't seem to learn from the history, or they don't seem to learn from what has happened in the past, right? And then no matter how much people inform American voters, there's still, like, they can't stop it. So that's one example of how everything is psychological. And then the information itself is not enough. And there has to be something more. And that is its essence, or that this critical ingredient, I would say, in my opinion, came from the WikiLeaks publication of the Colorado Matter video. That visceral image did something to us. It cuts through that all the propaganda, all disinformation, and directly spoke to our heart. And then we remembered, because it's our heart that remembers. It's not our head that understands the information and try to analyze and try to see what is right. It's not. It's our heart. And so WikiLeaks provided a way to directly speak to the heart. And that's what, you know, and that material came from Chosha Manning, came from her conscience. And that was not, you know, how she made the decision was not a intellectual, analytical process. If that was an intellectual process, she would have shied away from it. She would not have taken that risk. That's a suicide. No, but she made that choice because her conscience said that's the right thing to do. And because she remembered our inherent obligation to one another. And she followed her heart from my perspective. So we have to connect, I think, the American public, or ordinary people around the world to that conscience. And that's exactly what Wikileaks done. And perhaps in the most beautiful way through their publication of the Colorado Matter video.
Absolutely. And I think it's such an important point. As you say, it's the images that speak to us in a way that is non-intellectual, it's non-verbal. And in that way, it's much, much deeper than, the thousands and thousands and thousands of words that WikiLeaks has also published. In some ways, those images were so much more impactful.
Exactly, right.
Yeah.
Because I think that we intuitively know what is wrong. Yeah. And we don't have to be told how it's wrong. We know. And it's the same thing about Assange, what's happening to Assange. I mean, what has been done to Assange? We know that's wrong, and we don't have to read all of those articles or get that information about what's happening to Julian. I mean, if you look at the physical deterioration and mental deterioration that he exhibited on Monday, we know there's something deeply wrong. And so that's, but then there is that loud noise coming from the mainstream media that denies our intuitive knowing, denied what we know to be right. So I think it's just we need to directly speak to ordinary people. I mean, as fellow human beings about what's happening to Julian and all whistleblowers. Then I think eventually we would understand. Eventually, public would understand, and then they would start trusting what they already know.
Stepping away just slightly from WikiLeaks, about basically comparing WikiLeaks in the way that it has acted to liberate us by giving us that truth that was hidden from us, compared with, for example, do you have any perspective on the way that psychology, and I know that others have written about this quite a bit, but I wanted to ask you to speak on it, and that is the way that psychology has been used not only to basically keep us slaves to the status quo, but actively in order to find better ways of propagandizing us. And we see, whether it's, Lisa Johnson's pieces on that type of topic and the CIA advertising for psychologists, and that type of issue. I just wanted to ask you to kind of compare that with what WikiLeaks has done and contrast that to some extent.
I think knowledge is a power. And those of us who gain the knowledge, they have a choice. They have a choice to use the knowledge to control other people and gain power over them, or they use the knowledge to serve for other people, to help other people. And in my opinion, WikiLeaks, Julian Assange has done exactly, chose the path to use knowledge in service for others. And I think, CIA, intelligence agency and US government, those who are inside, they chose to abuse that power. So that to me, it became so much like obviously present the contrast between the two. And that's why we are now seeing this battle involving the First Amendment and with WikiLeaks at the front line of this battle. And I think, and this is the choice that we all have to go through this, and we all have to make our own choice as to how we want to use knowledge. And I think Julian has made that choice. Churchill Manning made that choice. Edward Snowden made that choice. And all of us here made that choice. And people in academia, they have massive responsibility, in my opinion, because currently how the society is structured, they were placed in a position of power, and they're placed in a position of authority, so that they can abuse the authority, of course. So again, I think it presents these choices.
And speaking of those choices, how would you advise young prospective students, very young academics, making the choice to enter academia? How do you advise them in actively I guess, going into it well with the intention of making a difference and actively affecting change, not just to sit there and, you know, study academia for the sake of it and for the sake of career alone. Do you have any advice to people going in with that intention in mind?
For instance, I actually went into academia wanting to become a clinical psychologist. I mean, I had a whole intention to do the practicum and fulfill the internship hours and become professional. And I decided not to because there was something more important that happened during the time that I was in academia. And I just simply followed my heart, simply followed what is important, what is right for me. And as a result, I mean, I learned more about history. I learned more about how the world works through Wikileaks. And this was a tremendous, I mean, gave me tremendous knowledge and information, and that I would never have anywhere, or would not have anywhere in any kind of official learning environment, I guess. So, you know, I would tell young people, you know, universities and institutions are not the only place that you can learn. You know, if you want to learn, if you want to understand history, if you want to learn about the world, you know, engage actively in the world. And so that's maybe the advice I give to them. So, you know, and you can also learn psychology, you know, you can also learn politics. I mean, all those things. And just look at Julian as an example. I mean, he's incredibly brilliant. I mean, knowledgeable about everything, you know, almost. And he just learned by himself. I mean, through engaging in, you know, what he's passionate about, what he thinks important. So, yeah.
So basically, so what I'm taking away from your comments is the advice to, you know, whether we're prospective students, whether somebody is going to academia or any other venture, your advice in terms of activism or in terms of trying to really affect change rather than just study history or that type of thing, is to make the same type of moral and conscience-based judgment that Assange, Manning, Snowden, and others have made, even though we might not be in the positions that those people were. We might not be facing the same type of it's to follow this. Yeah.
And I mean, I give that advice more so based on the current economic, you know, configuration of, you know, higher education. I mean, currently, I mean, at least in the US, when students want to learn and decide to go to university, they have to get into massive student debt. And that would unfree them, basically. That would make them be a slave, you know, and they become unfree and they can't really act out of a conscience simply because they have to pay off the student loan. And that, you know, narrows down their choices in what they want to do for future. And so I say more so, you know, you don't have to go into debt. You can learn, you know, and you can be confident, and you can, you know, be knowledgeable about what's happening in the world.
You know, debt slavery is definitely the phrase that comes up when you describe that. And I know that so many young people are going through that type of decision-making process of whether it's worth it or not to take on that type of debt.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. No, and I go ahead, please.
Well, and then also that there is, one would recognize, I mean, when I entered into academia, of course, I was naive, you know, I didn't really understand how system works and stuff. I was honestly believing that academia is a place where, you know, people actually care about social justice, or, you know, there's a thing called academic freedom and all of that stuff, you know. And then how naive I was, you know, when I got in. That's not the case. I mean, there's this economic incentive that systematically make it difficult for us to speak truth, and actually research about things that challenge the current political, you know, structure of power, for instance. So, you know, so that's one actually piece of the truth I got out of entering into academia. And, you know, so for instance, in the US, anyone who speaks about, be critical about Israel, you know, what Israel is doing, to Palestinians, for instance, then they might lose tenure. They might be kicked out from their positions, and they lose jobs and things like that. So there is, we have to understand there is this restriction and the systemic kind of indoctrination of making us be professional and making us conform to this dominant narrative, and we become very unconscious. I mean, we think that we're actually fighting for justice and all of that stuff, but we will be indoctrinated to the system.
That is such an important point, and it's something that we have not, as a discussion, especially relation to WikiLeaks, but in general, we don't have that discussion enough. We don't talk about the type of conformity in academia and in universities that happens that is just as, if not worse, than the type of conformity you see in journalism. I mean, we talk about the kind of co-opted narratives in journalism. We talk about propaganda in journalism, but we don't talk about propaganda in academia almost at all. It's just not a discussion that we have. So thank you for bringing that up. That's really important.
Right. And then I'd like to point out one other thing, which is, we have a DSM, basically the Psychological Diagnostic Manual, which has a certain definitions to label people, right? Diagnose people to have certain psychological disorders. And what was interesting is that there's new label created, which is called the, what is it? Defiance, something about the people who defy authority, the people who challenge authority. And that's listed as a kind of a psychological disorder. And which is astonishing, because then whistleblowers or someone like Julian Assange is easily labeled as, somebody who has psychological issue.
Pathologizing it.
Pathologizing it,
Yeah.
yes. But then where does that criteria come from, right? That someone to say, which activities are ill, which are healthy, I mean, who make that designation? And that's, again, it's coming from the central authority, that they are the one who say these activities are allowed, and then draw a line between what is healthy and what is pathology, basically.
It seems so insidious that we don't talk about that. We do talk about the FBI basically calling anyone who dissents a domestic terrorist. I mean, at least we talk about that being as awful as it is, but we just don't talk about what you've just brought up regarding the DSM and the pathologizing of dissent. That's incredible to me, that it's just not a conversation we have. I think to some extent it speaks to the way that we still allow arbiters of truth. Like, maybe we're starting to question the arbiters of truth in the news media, but we haven't really begun to do it in the realms of psychology and academia.
Well, anyone, I think, expert, anyone who are placed in the position of expert, basically, because they are the ones who are indoctrinated with orthodox knowledge. And then the orthodox knowledge is produced by those in power. They are the ones who basically, receive this dominant knowledge and then try to control and regulate other people's activities. This is done by journalists, of course. The journalists engage in perception management, and this is, of course, done by psychologists who pathologize people. And I mean, so everything is just and this leads to what Julian often talk about, the notion of illegitimate authority. Authority itself is fine, but we have to understand whether that authority is legitimate or not, and then decide whether we want to give somebody our authority or not. And we cannot be just blind, just trusting everyone, just because they're expert, just because they're professors, or just because they're policemen, or just because they're journalists working for New York Times,
No, I wanted to add that that's so brilliant in terms of seeing that WikiLeaks didn't just give us tools to criticize power in the media and in politics or the military. It gives us a tool to really criticize power in general. And maybe that's what's so revolutionary about WikiLeaks, and why it scares that embedded power structure so much, because WikiLeaks is so generalized.
Exactly. Well, WikiLeaks challenged the professional class, basically, because what WikiLeaks has done, I mean, I say this often and often, but I mean, WikiLeaks just didn't make journalism and just better or more effective. I mean, what WikiLeaks fundamentally has done is that WikiLeaks enabled the capacity for everyone around the world to perform the job that journalists used to do. So that WikiLeaks opened the door for citizen journalism, so that we can apply the First Amendment to ourselves and start to inform ourselves. That makes journalism basically obsolete. Like professional journalism, we don't need to have professional journalism to some degree, or like we would be able to challenge actually professional journalists, because they have to do way better job than citizen journalists for them to survive, right?
Right.
So that's why journalists in Guardian or New York Times, they don't like Assange, because instinctively they know WikiLeaks has done fundamentally put them out of their business. So that's why they fight against, you know, I mean, they smear Assange and all of that stuff.
Well, Nozomi, I just wanted to pursue this line with you about a culture that does not want to look at itself the way it really is, that denies certain really ugly features about it, and then ostracizes or destroys the few people within that culture who have the courage or determination to point out what's wrong. And I wanted to ask you, why are there so few people in a given culture that do that, that don't accept the group understanding of themselves? For example, American people don't want to see themselves as being a nation of aggressive war and exploitation of the planet, etc. They want to see themselves as defending democracy. So the leaders can get away with that very easily, this lie that we're spreading democracy, when anybody objectively sees that as not the case. So it's about how you feel about yourself. That's how easily it is for leaders to get away with that. And why are so few people in a culture able to step outside and say, wait a minute, that's rubbish?
Well, I think that people in America, I mean, we are grown up, most of us grown up with European dualistic morality, which creates a radical separation of evil and good. So that there is this, you know, we have this mentality of this is good, this is evil, and that there is a clear line between the two. And our part of, I mean, from I don't want to get into the more, you know, use the psychological jargons to explain this, but you know, we have, I mean, psychology, we have understanding of ego. Ego is like our thinking, and it's how we identify ourselves, or the basis of our identity. And part of human nature is to project parts of ourselves that we don't want to look at, or we don't want to admit that belong to us. So that's why it's easy for us to actually, I mean, it's something that we always do, you know, since we are young. I mean, we tend to like to think that we are good, right? So then neighbors or our friends, they are the bad ones. Or if we recognize that there is a certain unfavorable trait within us, it's hard for us to accept that they belong to us and take responsibility for it. I mean, that's just a part of human nature wherever we are, right? So that, and then our culture that is based on European Judeo-Christian religious dualistic morality, discourage us to actually acknowledge our shadow, acknowledge our darkness, and then instead makes us to project upon people overseas. And that's what media does. Media paints people overseas to be, you know, they are the terrorists, you know, they are the evil ones, and they are you know, they want our freedom and all that stuff. And then we just fall for that, right? It's part of our kind of human nature. And that's why I remember Tricia Manning during court martial pointed out that the reason why she released the material that relate to, you know, Iraq war or Afghanistan, but that she wanted American public to know that not everyone is, not everyone is like enemy. You know, she wanted us to know who they really are. And you know, not like the demonized people. I mean, they are just like us, right? So, and I think the question of your question about why there are people like Churchill or Julian who rise above this kind of conditioning and be able to stay true to our humanness, so to speak, to try to see, try to understand each other, not just as our projection, but to let them reveal who they are. And I think the reason why they were able to do it is, I say they had, I think they had extraordinary empathy, I think. And also ability to be true to themselves. And which is, I think, their characteristics. I mean, that's why I think they are extraordinary people.
Well, I mean, yes, they are extraordinary people, but it's not just Julian. It's anyone who questions their own culture and steps outside. And that could be a lowly journalist or a website like Consortium News, for example. Not in any way to put ourselves in the category of what Chelsea Manning or Julian Assange have done and what they're going through. But it's just so rare to see some people who are able to just look at ourselves at how we really are. And this becomes a very, very risky thing to do in terms of losing your job, for example, or whatnot, or losing friends. I cannot stand anymore to hear American people regurgitate these absolute cartoonish views of the world. And you mentioned the good and evil.
Yes,
this is a child's idea of the world and the way life is.
Right.
There's no gray area, right?
And that's, I mean, that's what we see so enacted in U.S., electoral arena. Every 4 years, the candidate come and then we project, and then Trump is the evil, Clinton is the evil, and then we both kind of project each other, right? And demonize each other and stuff, and then act out of these emotions. I mean, and in some ways, I think those who control us, they play with these low emotions that we have.
Yes. Well, that gets to the question. Yeah.
Exactly.
That gets to the question of how the people who control us, are they themselves victims of this self-delusion as well, or are they really clever, some of them, and know what they're doing? I think you have to go to each individual person to figure that out.
The father of basically PR, the public relations or propaganda machine, is Edward Bernays. I mean, he studied from his uncle Freud, Sigmund Freud, and his understanding of the unconscious. So, and he found a way to manipulate people's emotions and create a projection and stuff, So we who don't understand, this psychological, how we work psychologically, I mean, we become extremely vulnerable. And that's what advertisement company do, right? We just buy things because our emotions and desires, they are played, they are exploited. And then now we have surveillance company, and they know more than that. There's a thing about the saying about everybody say that Google knows more about you than your mother, right? So it's like they understand our deepest desire, and they play with it, they exploit that.
The advertising is really where it began in the public relations in the 1920s. That came out of the Creel Committee, which was Woodrow Wilson set up this committee to try to sell the war.
Exactly.
It worked so well that the private companies decided to create public relations departments, and then advertising came along, and people have been primed. And now advertising went back into politics in a big way when TV in the 1960s, the first debate, so that there's no distinction between advertising and political propaganda right now. I want to just, when you talk about projection, there's two examples that always get me. One was John Kerry, when he was Secretary of State, actually made this statement regarding what he said was a Russian invasion of Ukraine, which there's no evidence for. There were already Russian troops in Ukraine. They're legally in the Crimean base. They left the base. There has never been tanks moving across the border. We know that General Breedlove, who was the head of NATO, lied. Der Spiegel did a report that he completely lied about 40,000 troops. There were no troops. And yet John Kerry stood up there and said, in the 21st century, nations don't invade other nations. And he voted for the Iraq invasion. Now, how could people not have seen that? He voted for the invasion of Iraq, which was a massive traditional military invasion of a sovereign nation, unprovoked, the supreme war crime according to the Nuremberg protocols. And yet he can go out there and say that. And it was the same about the Russians getting involved in Syria. Putin made a big speech at the UN in September 2015 at the General Assembly. He invited the United States to join Russia the way the Soviet Union and America did to fight the Nazis, to fight ISIS. And these bloody jihadists who had become extremely powerful and had to be stopped. Of course, the Obama administration said no, and the reporting, I remember I was at Wall Street Journal then, and I got to see the other people's copy, and I didn't write that story, but I read where in the first paragraph, this was Russia reestablishing its imperial glory. They're accusing Russia of imperialism. And if I'm going to have an imperial adventure, I'm not inviting my enemy to take part in it. He invited the U.S. to join him. But see, Russia's the imperialist. Russia does the invasions. It's just, I'm sorry, I get infuriated by how the media lets them get away with this. For their own vanity, their own careers, whatever their motives are, they've lost the plot here. That's not what journalism is supposed to do. Supposed to be doing what we do here.
Yeah, and I think that part of projection is that we twist, we alter reality. I mean, it's you know what I mean. To some degree, I think we like to think that they intentionally fabricate information or you know, alter reality, but I think they unconsciously do it because they don't want to see the reality. I mean, so in order to protect themselves from actually facing the reality, I mean, that's part of psychological defense mechanism, you know, and oftentimes, I mean, the good example of this, of course, is that, let's say, if a wife is trapped with you know, violent husband, and you know, she knows that her husband is cheating on her, and she has all the evidence, right, that he is not faithful to her, and then all of that stuff. But she doesn't want to face the reality, doesn't want to actually find out and face the truth. So all she does is that she make excuses, you know, she changes, she alters the fact and reality and minimize and all of that stuff, that in order to protect herself from facing the painful truth, right? Because once you find out the truth, you have to change, you have to act differently, right? So, I mean, it's something similar, in my opinion. So some people don't want to face, I mean, some people truly believe, I think many Americans believe that they are, you know, their country is the greatest one on this planet. I mean, they like to think that Americans are great people. They don't want to see that the, you know, US is invading those countries, the countries that have shown no threat to their own.
Or that we have no health care, no health insurance system, and we're behind so many other countries. Exactly. We're still the best. We're still the best.
So that's why they want to attack Russia, for instance, you know, and they, you know, so that, or China saying they are bad, you know, they don't have free speech, or you know, they have dictatorship there. But in the US, we have democracy. In the US, we have free speech. You know, we have all glorious stuff. You know, we are very civilized. I mean, that's how we want to paint ourselves, right? And then so what Wikileaks has done, I mean, what Julian has done is to shatter that illusion that we have. You know, that we have to face the reality that we are not greatest country on the planet, number one, and we don't have free speech. Number two, we don't have democracy. I mean, that's so painful for Americans to realize, and to know that their government have been lying to them, and their government have been corrupted.
You know what's interesting?
It's hard.
Nozomi, you talk about the individualism of the West as opposed to other cultures. And yet it's the lack of individualism that allows this tribal mentality that we're the best, we're right, you can't criticize us. So it's a different kind of individualism that somebody like Chelsea Manning or Julian Assange is displaying. This is real individualism, to go against your group, to endanger your own future by doing that because you want to help the group. And the group, rather than showing, they show the the individualism, I can make more money than you can.
Right.
My car is bigger than yours. That's the kind
exactly.
of individualism we have in the
Yeah.
West.
And
Not
then
the serious one that we need. That's tribal then.
Exactly. It's very much tribe. I mean, you're right, Joe. And I think that this identity tied to nation state, that's what we have. So that we think that we are American, we think we are, you know, Japanese or French, or, you know, so that anything that, you know, that we cannot think of ourselves as global citizen. And I think Chelsea and Julian, I mean, they, I think, look at themselves as a, you know, just a human being and who lives on this planet. That's why their compassion extend. I mean, it goes beyond the borders. Why on the earth do you think that Julian, who is a Australian citizen, would actually do things, you know, help American whistleblower? You know, I mean, because or care about people in Tunisia, or care about people in, you know, I mean, care about Catalonian people, you know, because, you know, he simply is concerned about the well-being of all humanity, you know, all people, and that makes them different, right? I mean, so that we, and then I think those of us who are able to look at ourselves as global citizens, who are in touch with our own humanity, you know, we don't fall into this nationalistic propaganda. We don't, you know, we will examine fact. We are open to examine fact and look at information, you know, instead of just falling into this tribe mentality and quickly make a judgment saying, oh, you know, Russia is trying to attack us, or, you know what I mean? So
Yeah,
it's a nationalism. It's the collectivism.
Now,
That
to be
is,
fair, though, I think all societies have this function.
yeah, exactly,
Just that America
exactly.
is the most powerful, so it's the most dangerous. But
Right.
even you're in Japan. Japan's
Oh,
pretty
yes.
conservative, right? It's not easy to step outside and criticize the Japanese nation, is it?
Of course. I mean, the same. And then, you know, what happened during, I mean, you know, before World War II, I mean, if you remember, I mean, we had this fanaticism, right? I mean, this Japanese version of Manifest Destiny, that we are the one, you know, God-chosen nation that is supposed to conquer the whole entire Asia. And so Japan was an empire, you know, in the East. So, you know, we all have this kind of psychological vulnerability to fall into this collectivism, and that creates a massive, you know, psychosis. Then once this is activated, then nothing would get through, you know, because it's yeah, we lose our ability to think critically.
And only a few individuals with empathy and courage is basically what you're saying. Can risk
Right.
their futures by speaking out against this. Just
Yes.
aren't enough. They just aren't enough. And
Well,
then,
those of us who are still in touch with our own humanity, who remember who we are, you know, we are not just, I mean, I'm not just Japanese or American. I mean, I am a human being, foremost. And, you know, and in this, we live in this nation state paradigm where we are constantly given a message that, you know, we are Americans, we are Japanese, or, you know, we have to fight against each other, you know. That's why we can't solve issues like climate change that impact all of us, right? Because we are always divided into nations and things and try to compete against each other, you know. But once we recognize and awaken our own humanity, we realize that issues that we face we share the same issues, right? Yeah, so I think that I think it's important for us to remember who we are, and that's the key. And that's the awakening is actually, I mean, that was demonstrated by individuals like Julian and Chelsea.
Elizabeth, back to you.
Yeah, I just have one last question. Listening to you both has brought up it just reminded me of something that Carl Jung said, and, you know, educate me if I'm misquoting him. But I believe that he said something along the lines of enlightenment not coming from imagining figures of light, but coming from making the darkness conscious. And I think that ties so directly to WikiLeaks and making the shadow of the US imperialism conscious. And I just wanted to state that and get your thoughts on it before we ended the interview.
Oh yeah, I love that quote. I mean, it's so true, I think. I mean, it's if we can own our own shadow and darkness, no matter how painful it is, you know, that's the only way that we can actually achieve enlightenment. And, you know, we have not been civilized. That's what it is. I mean, I think one of the greatest, I mean, significance of WikiLeaks is WikiLeaks has shown us, you know, where Western civilization is currently. Have we, you know, civilized yet? And we have to actually ask ourselves that question and answer that. And I think the civilized nation would not engage in illegal wars, not engage in, you know, exploitation of other nations. Civilized nations would function with the principle of law. You know, the civilized nation. I mean, if Western civilization is truly civilized, we would not be seeing what's happening to Julian Assange right now. You know, exactly. I mean, here, this journalist, I mean, greatest journalist of our century, has been imprisoned for practicing journalism. And he has been put into solitary confinement.
Right.
And you know, I mean, so this is, are we really civil? No. If we are civil and truly enlightened, that's not happening. And we have to actually really look into this and ask ourselves questions. And for that, it's painful, but we have to recognize and we have to look at our own shadow and darkness. And that's happening, you know, I mean, right before our eyes with you know, Julian Assange's extradition case.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was going to say, is that he's continuing to do that so far beyond just what WikiLeaks has published. Right now, he's still showing that shadow to us.
Exactly. And then he's punished, he's attacked because he let us see the darkness, you know, let us see the shadow of Western civilization. And that's why he, you know, he's just made into an enemy. But this is the way we, you know, this is the only way that we would actually achieve civilization. We would achieve enlightenment, is to get through, to own our shadow and darkness.
Well, those are excellent words to end this with. You know, I'm thinking of a prehistoric tribe where there is a deluded belief in certain God, and then one person steps out and tries to alert the group that they're headed towards disaster if they go on that course. And instead of listening to that person, they send them off into the forest.
Exactly.
That's what we've got here. Assange and Manning and other whistleblowers were trying to help a group that's going off the cliff to stop that behavior, and instead they won't listen to them. They punish them, and that's the future we may be looking at. Nozomi, so much.
I mean,
thank you so much.
I'd like to say one thing, that in my eyes, Julian Assange is the imprisoned light of Western civilization, and we have to free him in order for us to be civilized and enlightened. Well,
they can't say they weren't warned when things go off the rails here in our society as we continue with this delusional grab of power and violence around the world. Thank you, Nozomi, for joining us from San Francisco area. Really hope to have you back on again. It was terrific.
Yeah, thank you for coming on.
It's my pleasure.